Hello, my name is Mark Mabrito. I'm a professor of English at Purdue University Northwest. I teach courses in our writing concentration and also in a certificate I developed, the certificate in writing for interactive media. Several of the courses there are courses that focus on using artificial intelligence and generative artificial intelligence. So today I'm presenting a workshop, the topic of which is generative artificial intelligence in the classroom. Just to go over some of the topics that we're going to be covering in the workshop. First, what is artificial intelligence? And then we're going to talk about what is generative artificial intelligence. Now, sometimes people mix those two together or kind of conflate them. But I'll talk about what the differences are because we're really focusing on, in this workshop, generative artificial intelligence in the classroom. So we're going to look at ways of how one might use generative artificial intelligence or Gen AI in the classroom. I'm going to highlight some projects, classroom projects that you could either expand upon or use as is in your classroom. And then finally, we're going to consider what are some other things I could do as a teacher with generative artificial intelligence. So let's begin with a definition of artificial intelligence. This is a very common definition. Artificial intelligence, as we can see here, is a simulation of human intelligence programmed to think, learn, and make decisions. So in other words, it's using computer-simulated machine learning to sort of simulate the way a human would do it. Not exactly, right? It's a simulation. We may not realize this, but artificial intelligence is basically in every aspect almost of our lives. For example, we're very familiar in factories where robots assemble products. That's an application of artificial intelligence. We've all been on Amazon probably and bought something, and then Amazon recommends, well, since you bought that, maybe you'd want to buy this. Right? That's an example of an algorithm or artificial intelligence suggesting that. Same thing, you watch a show or a movie on Netflix, and then all of a sudden Netflix suggests something else you might like based on the show or movie you just watched. Artificial intelligence algorithms are all over social media. They're constantly tracking what you do, trying to suggest other ways you can engage. Data mining, that is collecting data from you as you navigate your way around social media. And then finally, we're all probably pretty familiar with chatbots, which use a weaker form of artificial intelligence. I'm talking about things like virtual assistants, Alexa in your home, maybe you use Siri. Okay, so that's artificial intelligence. So now let's consider what is generative artificial intelligence. Well, that is a subset of AI, and that is used to create new content. This is what we're most familiar with. So things like large language models, like ChatGPT and Claude and Gemini used to produce text, images, DALL-E, Midjourney, if you've heard of those programs, are generative AI programs to create images. You can create any kind of content, music, video, and more, by using an existing data set, the set that the model was trained on. So we use it for things like, as I just said, text generation, images, multimodal, right, sound, video. Folks use it for generating code, helping them to code. And it can also be used, and I'll suggest this later on, as a technique. It can be used for remixing, that is, taking one piece of content and easily converting it to another. So why are we concerned then, beyond those concerns, specifically when we talk about students in the classroom using generative AI? And I'll state the obvious here, but I'm going to give you two ideas why we're concerned. One comes to this issue of critical thinking. We feel like, well, if you're using a generative AI model to somehow generate content, you're not engaging in critical thinking. And then there's the question of authenticity. If you use generative AI to produce some sort of content that you didn't produce solely by yourself, can we consider that authentic? Do we even want that in the classroom? And these are important questions and concerns, and hopefully we'll deal with some of these throughout the workshop and maybe offer a different perspective on that. But assuming we can even get beyond these concerns, then the next major concern, I think, deals with assessment. So when we have these Gen AI generated products, whatever they are, and I'm talking broadly here, not just text, but anything generated with Gen AI, what are we assessing? How are we assessing it? We don't really have models for assessing something that was produced with generative AI. And then finally, in a moment of frustration, we might even ask, why are we even bothering to assess it? Okay? So these are the concerns, really, that we have. And as we learn more about generative AI and think about tactics for how we could use it in the classroom, perhaps we can lessen some of those concerns. Now that we have a basic understanding of generative AI, let's consider how you might use it in your classroom. What sorts of projects could you create, and what else could you do with it as a teacher? Generative AI sort of came on our radar, I think, for most of us back in the fall of 2022 when OpenAI released ChatGPT, and ChatGPT became the topic of conversation in many educational settings. Early 2023, as a way of addressing those concerns, UNESCO released a report talking about how generative AI, in this case they're talking about ChatGPT, but this could refer to any generative AI, could be used in the classroom. And this is a graphic from that report. And what I want to do here is simply focus on the left column, the red text. And as we look at that language, and what they're suggesting there are roles. What kind of role could ChatGPT or any generative AI play in the classroom? Let's look at that language if we can. Okay, so we have things like possibility engine, collaboration coach, guide on the side, study buddy, motivator. A common theme throughout that language, I think, is they're suggesting ChatGPT, or again, any generative AI, is sort of a personal assistant. Okay, and this helped to calm some fears, I think. It's not going to replace anyone's job. It's not going to create all the content for students, but it's simply viewing it as a personal assistant, something there to help you in your task. Another model, but this model, I think, helps us to think of generative AI in terms of pedagogy. Now, the first model helps us to think about, well, how we want to use generative AI, or what level of use we want of generative AI in the classroom. But this model, I'll suggest, talks a bit more about pedagogy. In other words, how can we do that? How can we implement generative AI? And I've broken it down here into 5 areas. So the first area is what I call experience generative AI. So this starts with students just simply interacting with different models of generative AI. For example, if we're talking about text, this could be ChatGPT, Claude, Gemini, Copilot. Okay, those are all large language models. And then as they're doing that, sort of just dipping their toe in the water, if you will, this is an opportunity for discussion. So we can have this conversation with students. Well, what are the applications of generative AI? What are the ethics of using generative AI? How do we cite and attribute generative AI, which is important, right? We're not just using it without attribution. If we use it, we're going to acknowledge that. Then we move on to the mechanics of using generative AI, what I call practice. And this involves what we call prompt engineering or crafting. In other words, here we teach students how do you interact with generative AI to produce something. What are some efficient ways of doing that? And so here we spend time looking at different prompts. What are the different prompts? How can you use them? What kind of content might they produce? Then we move on to applying generative AI. So, and I use the word collaborate here because I think that's important, that the student is actually working with generative AI to produce projects. And here I'm talking about a variety of projects, not just text, but it could be images, could be sound, could be video. And then some consideration, how is this used in the workplace? How can we simulate that sort of use in the classroom? So eventually when students graduate, they have some preparation for using generative AI in the workplace. Then I move on to problem solving with generative AI, and this is something I will showcase today as well. Here, we're not just interacting with a generative AI model, but we're actually producing new generative AI. And I'll explain that later. And then finally, assessment, reflection, self-reflection on the part of the student, which occurs throughout the whole process, and then assessment on the part of the instructor, usually driven through something like a grading rubric. So in terms of how this might work out in the early stages, I have this heuristic that I use with students, and I call this a collaboration log. And the purpose of this is, as the student's working on a project with generative AI, they can reflect and document what they're doing. So the model begins at the top, as you can see, with defining your goals and expectations of collaboration. What do I mean by that? Well, in other words, a student has to consider what models am I going to use? Why am I using those models? What sorts of challenges do I think I'll face using models, generative AI models, to produce this project? Now, of course, students are not going to be able to answer those questions unless you do your part as the instructor and teach them about these models and have that discussion, that earlier discussion of what is generative AI, what are some applications of it, so they have some sort of background or context. Next, we move on to what I call demonstrating procedural awareness. In other words, how are they going to interact with these generative AI models? And so here we're getting to that area I talked about, prompt engineering crafting, right? What are you going to use? What kinds of prompts can you use? After that, they have to assess what I call the output. I'm not calling it content yet because to me it's still output. So they've got some feedback, some output from the generative AI model, what are the strengths, limitations of it? Are there biases present? And again, they can identify those because we've had those earlier conversations about biases. Then again, they move back in and prompt with further detail. So they're doing it all over again. They're getting output, they're revising it, they're considering what changes, revisions need to be made, what changes they need to make, what additional information they might want from a generative AI model. And this is a recursive process, as I try to indicate by those arrows, right? It's not necessarily linear, it's going back and forth. Eventually, that collaboration has to move out of the little circle of the student and the generative AI model and has to be seen in a broader context. So now the student is invited to consult outside sources, academic sources. How does this new information verify and expand upon what they have so far? And this outside information isn't limited just to academic sources, but it's also people. Feedback from peers, instructors, maybe even feedback from other generative AI models. Eventually, then, we have to arrive at a final product, and then they consider the publication requirements, and this is important because now they're going to acknowledge and cite the contributions of generative AI. What are the guidelines in their field? And most of the major style sheets, MLA, APA, Chicago style, all have guidelines for how you cite and acknowledge use of generative AI, and that's important. Okay, another version of this that I sometimes use, a shortened version, and I'll show you this in terms of this particular one happens to be for an image project. This was a project where students were writing a children's book. Okay, but it's the same sort of principle. So they name the model that they're using. They detail the type of prompt that they were using, and these prompts are for images. Then they state the actual prompt that they wrote to interact with the generative AI model. In this case, it's DALL-E 3. Then they state their intent. What did they hope they were going to get from generative AI by using that prompt? And then they evaluate it. They assess it. Was the result what they hoped to get? Was it effective? Is it lacking somehow? And then finally, as a way of documenting it, I asked them to link to it. So they're linking to the actual image. You can do this with text too. Virtually all the models support linking to a chat session or linking to the product of a chat session. So then we can see it. We can see the interaction right there, what you did. Okay, we're about halfway through, and this would be a good time, I think, to pause the video and take a break. So in the first half, what I've done is I've tried to give you a basic orientation to what generative AI is, suggest some models of how it could be used in the classroom. After that, processing that information, hopefully you don't look like this, so maybe it turned out better than this. But as we go forward now for the rest of the workshop, I'm going to be presenting specific activities, examples, what I've done with generative AI in the classroom, what I suggest you could do with generative AI in the classroom. While we're taking a break, if you want, you can scan this QR code and also present this at the end of the video. But that QR code will take you to a Google site where I put in there resources for you, some of the examples that I'm using here in the presentation, examples of the models, and then also a list of outside resources for you. So just to give you some resources after we're done with this particular workshop. Okay, so let's take a pause right here and then come back for the second half. Okay, through the magic of time, hopefully you are now back for the second half of the presentation. On this slide, before I get into talking about specific assignments and activities and whatnot, I just gave you a little breakdown of all the different tools that were used in the production of these exercises and assignments and activities. And again, this will be in that QR code resource for you. But just to give you an overview of what we used, here's some of the text generation or large language models that I use, some of the image generation models that I use, and then also for the video, where students create a video, I used InVideo. Okay, so going forward, I'm going to be structuring these assignments based on the model that I showed you earlier and focusing on these actions: interact, discuss, practice, collaborate, and create new Gen AI and reflect. Okay, so I'd like to begin with the first three. The acts of interacting, discussing, and practicing. And what does that mean exactly? Well, here's some suggested activities. For example, interact. We could, at the very beginning, as a way of starting students with generative AI, have reflective conversations with different generative AI models, compare those models, and basically just explore. Many students are not familiar with all these different models, so this is a good example to kind of dip the toe in. I'll give you some exercises in a minute on how to do that. Discussing, this is a good opportunity to discuss topics like how does generative AI factor into academic integrity? Is there bias and fairness in AI outputs? Copyright issues, and then also how to cite and acknowledge generative AI in your work. And then I'm going to be talking a bit about prompting. And I'll show you some exercises I use with students to get them engaged in prompting and understand what prompting is. Okay, so let's start. I'm going to highlight a few assignments here at the very top of that model where it says experience generative AI. So this is the interact, discuss aspect of the model to get students a little familiar with the different Gen AI models and how they might use them. So this first assignment, really a starting point, is I ask students to bring in a sample of their writing, and then to ask for feedback on that writing from at least two different generative AI models. So what is the purpose of this? Now I call this loose feedback because they're not really asking anything specific of the models, they just want some general feedback. And then they reflect on, well, was that useful? Was it helpful? And many times it's not going to be. So then we switch over to what I call targeted feedback. Okay, so and this introduces the idea of prompt crafting or prompt engineering. So again, we're going to ask for feedback, but we're asking for it in a more direct way. So how we do that is I give them this little handout. And again, I should say everything I'm showing you here is in that linked Google site through the QR code. So I may be going through it kind of quickly on the screen, but you have access to it. So then I give them a formula for prompting, which I'm not going to go through here, but it's called the CREATE formula. And so they experiment with that using Claude in this instance, but it could also be done with other models. And then they reflect on that. And what they'll find is that when they give more direct queries and more specific queries, prompt crafting, into the model, they get better feedback. Again, initial assignment. After that, another thing I like to do is to explore using GenAI to solve a problem. So usually I break students into groups, ask them figure out some kind of problem or issue that's affecting college students, who they are. And then, now that we've learned something about prompting, I've given them a few more handouts about prompting, create a multi-layered prompt that can be fed to a GenAI model, and to create an interactive experience to learn, discover more about the particular problem or the issue. And then I ask them to do this in at least 2 different GenAI models, and then they post their prompts and they talk about the feedback that they got from the GenAI model. So this encourages them to view generative AI as a collaborator in the sense of helping to solve some problem or issue. The next assignment I alluded to earlier on in the presentation, and this is what I call a remix. And there's 2 options here for students. They can take an existing concept theory or even a figure, historical literary figure that they've studied, and then they ask GenAI, and I list models there that they could use, to explain the concept or provide a person's biography in no more than 400 words. The other option is if they don't want to do that, then they bring in a sample of their own writing that they've done. And then what we do with that is we do what I call a remix. So we ask different models of generative AI to take that content and remix it into different content. For example, song lyrics of their favorite artist, a Shakespearean sonnet, a script treatment for a situation comedy, and one other genre of their choosing. This GenAI models actually tend to do a good job on this, and students are quite impressed by this, that they can take something either that they've acquired, the biography or their own work, and turn it into a completely different genre, or have GenAI turn it into a completely different genre. And then they take one of the outputs that they liked and they try to refine it further through prompting using that create handout that I alluded to. And then they write a reflection on the process. And they also share their prompts and their output with the class. Now, this is also a good exercise for talking about things like intellectual property. When GenAI converts something to a different genre, is that a violation of copyright? And these are the issues that are going on today with generative AI. And we can say, well, maybe it is, maybe it isn't, and in a sense it is, but this is how generative AI models work. Okay, so that's the purpose of that assignment. And then this is one for images, when we start working with images. So what I asked them to do is to use one of the image generators, in this case we're using DALL-E, and create some sort of image. Ask the GenAI model, prompted for some sort of image. We've studied prompts for images up to this point, and it could be the image of a favorite physical place, an animal, whatever. And then what I asked them to do, okay, using 2 different GenAI models to create images, is to do a Google image search and find an actual photograph of the same place, animal, or event. Okay, and then we compare what's missing. The one I generated through my prompts, why doesn't it look quite like the real version? Or maybe it does. How can I improve it? Then this launches us into a discussion of advanced prompting. Okay, so in other words, now how can we change that image to get it closer to what we want as our ideal image? And of course, I'm supplying them with handouts and readings with all sorts of different prompts that you can use to create images to give them that conceptual background. What I'd like to do now is to focus on the second half of my collaborative model. And here I'm going to highlight some of the projects that students do. I'm going to focus on classroom projects, and you can see listed there some examples. I'll talk about a simulation of a workplace project that students do to generate a public service campaign. Here they're working with not just text generators, but image generators and video. And then I'll also talk a bit about how you can use generative AI to program it to create new generative AI for your purposes. I have talked about student self-assessment throughout, and I'll also share with you instructor assessment in this segment, sharing with you a rubric for grading one of the assignments. I'm going to focus now on the collaborate part of my collaboration model. And I'm going to highlight some projects here, student projects, and explain why they are constructed the way they are and the purpose behind them. So I'm going to start with an early assignment that I do in one of my courses, and that is a traditional research paper, only a research paper done in collaboration with generative AI. And that collaboration log that I showed you earlier, this is an example of a completed collaboration log for that research paper. So you'll see here, these are the items from the log that I showed. And this is the student who is responding to these items. And you'll see that it's actually a pretty extensive assignment. It goes on here. And the point of this is not just to create more work for the student, but it's to create this transparency with working with generative AI. So you'll see here, not only is the student talking about defining the task, his expectations of working with generative AI, but also the prompts that he used, his evaluation of those prompts, a link to the session where he received feedback from those prompts. And then finally, he talks about how he's going to prompt with greater detail, the collaboration that he used outside of generative AI, which was peer review, instructor feedback, that's all listed here. So the point of the collaboration log is sort of twofold. It's to help the student understand how generative AI could be used to help in the construction of this research paper. It's also to provide for the instructor a look inside of that collaborative process, since it's all documented here, that the student went through with generative AI. Here's an example of that research paper that was produced from that collaboration log. You'll notice a couple of things here. One is we see in-text citations that don't look like normal in-text citations. That's because they're citations for generative AI. So you'll notice here we have a citation that says you are an expert editor with years, so on. It's the first few words of the prompt that the student used to generate that idea or sometimes that content from generative AI. So you see, we see another one here. And the way that works is if you go all the way to the works cited list, what you'll find, now these are traditional academic sources that are also cited in the paper because those are required. But then we come down here and you'll see here are those citations for the generative AI model. So the student gives the full prompt, documents the model and version that was used, and provides a link to the actual chat session where that prompt was used. Okay, here's the actual prompt. So this provides a real roadmap, if you will, for not only the student, but also the instructor to see the whole collaborative process, what was done, what was generated, how that made its way into the final project. Here's another example of a slightly, before I move on, I wanted to share, though, the grading rubric for that assignment. And what you'll see here is there is a separate section of the grading rubric for the traditional writing concerns for a research paper. But what you find here in this rubric is this is the evaluation of the collaborative process. And you'll notice, and I know I'm skimming here quickly because this is all in your Google site and you can reference it later, but the points on the rubric correspond to the points on the collaboration log. And this is basically assessing the quality of the collaboration that the student engaged in with generative AI. Okay, this next project, it's a little different. This is one using image generators, generative AI. The assignment here was basically to construct an alter ego and then write a narrative about the alter ego so the reader has, or the viewer has, a better sense of who the alter ego is. So you'll see what this student is doing. Okay, here the student is using generative AI to create these images. She's writing this narrative to better explain the alter ego. Okay, and then it goes on, it's in slide format, and then at the end, here are those citations. A little hard to see here, but again, this is all on your Google site. The citation for each figure that she generated with generative AI. Okay, the actual prompt that was used, the version, the name and version of the generative AI model, a link to the session where that was created. Again, the idea of full transparency. So we see not only the final product, but we see the collaboration that took place with generative AI to get to that final project. Here's another variation on that. And this is where I asked students to create a children's book. This was inspired by an event last year where a children's book was published. It was called Alice and Sparkle. And it was published by someone who had created the entire children's book using generative AI, and sparked a lot of conversations in the community. Conversations, for example, is this appropriate? What are the implications here for how generative AI can be used? What is this content? Is it the authors? Is it generative AI? So I wanted students to kind of get a sense of that. So I asked them to create a children's book on a topic of their choice. And what you'll see here, they're using, again, image generative AI. Here's the prompt that was used to create the image. Okay, here's the documentation to the model. Okay, we also, you'll see here, that's the cover page, but then you'll see here, okay, here's the prompt that was used. This is the result of that prompt, so on and so forth. So they're creating a children's book basically by working and collaborating with generative AI. Here's the collaboration log for that children's book, or a snippet of it. It's not the complete log. And you'll see, as I showed you in an earlier example, the student first identifies, first the model, in this case DALL-E 3, what kind of prompts do you want to use, what's the actual language of the prompt that you used, what was your intent, what did you hope to get in terms of content by using that prompt, and how do you think it worked out, evaluate the results. And then, of course, a link to the image. The whole idea of transparency. You can see laid out before you how the student collaborated with generative AI, how that process went, how they think the process went through their evaluation. Another final project I'll share with you, this is under that category of trying to stimulate students to think about ways they can use generative AI outside the classroom. So this is, as best as we can, a simulation of a workplace experience. So here students are part of a design team working for some agency creating a public service campaign. They decide on the topic of the public service campaign. And what they do is, it's in a couple of segments. The first segment, they create 5 ads, full-page ads for either a print or digital publication using generative AI, image generative AI. Here's the citation. Here's the prompt they use to create that image. again, the documentation, a link to the session that created that image. And then I ask students for an explanation. So basically to justify, why did you do it this way? Okay, why this image? How do you think this is going to contribute to the public service campaign, and so on. So you'll see here there were 5 images altogether. Here's another one. Here's the documentation for it, and here's the explanation of it. So again, the idea of transparency. Now, this was in a couple of parts, this assignment, so this was one part of it. The other part of it, which I can't show here, but it's in your, it just wouldn't be that easy to show on the screen here, but it's in your Google site, is I asked students to create a video to go along with the print campaign. And I used InVideo. And I should point out here that when I look for these tools for students to use, what I'm trying to do is to find tools that are free, because I don't want to add any extra burden onto students, having them to spend extra money to do something. So there's a drawback to that. Sometimes they're not necessarily the best tools to get you the best quality, but that's not really what I'm shooting for here. I'm shooting more for the experience of working with generative AI. So in InVideo, and you'll see an example of this in the Google site, students write script. They put it in video. It generates an initial video, many times not exactly what they'd hoped for, so they have to go in and tweak. A lot of revising takes place, right? They have to tweak the script to get the video close to what they want the video to be. Okay, so then that's another use of generative AI. And when they submit, of course, they submit not just the link to the final video, but they submit the script, the revisions of the script, and then a reflection on how the process went. Okay, so those are just some examples of projects. And again, you have access to all this in the Google site, not just these examples, but the actual assignment descriptions. So that is all available to you. What I'm going to show you now corresponds to that last item on my collaboration model, where it says solve a problem by creating new generative AI, and I'm going to explain what that means. So I'm showing you here a project that I created as an example for students. This is a course where I'm asking students to work on a much longer project, a collaboration with generative AI. The model that I'm showing students is centered around creating a series of blog posts about nutrition. So I'm using generative AI to create some ideas, text images for these blog posts. But then the next challenge I pose to students is, well, think about, based on the topic you're working on, what could be a custom application of generative AI that you could create applied to that problem? And so that's what I'm modeling here. So for these series of blog posts on nutrition, I created what we call a custom agent, or a custom GPT called Nutrition Coach. What does it do? Well, it interacts with the user. I have some conversation starters here, and it basically interacts with the user, helping them to decide what kind of nutritional needs do they have, what kind of diet could they have to meet those needs. So it's meant to be an interactive experience. Now I'm just going to show you very quickly how this works. I'm going to go behind the scenes, or under the hood, if you will, and I'm going to show you how this is programmed. First thing you need to do, of course, is to create a brand image for your custom agent, and I've done that here. You could do that with generative AI. You could use your own image. It has a name, a little description of what it does, but the main heart of it is right here, and what's under instructions. What this is basically is a series of prompts telling this custom agent how to behave when it interacts with the user. So you see here, it says you are a nutrition coach. Okay, you introduce yourself as Nutrition Nate, you ask for this information, and then it goes and provides a series of prompts. Now, for students to do this, get to this point where they're creating a custom agent, so obviously they have to know something about prompting. So this is an activity maybe that would occur later in a course or later in the process, where students have had more experience generating prompts and learning how to interact with these Gen AI models. So now they can go ahead and program one. And so you see here, basically, these are the prompts. Okay, it's just simply telling this agent, these are the areas you should focus on. Okay, now, also, in addition to that, and here are those conversation starters I created to get the user engaged. But in addition to all that is this area down here called knowledge files. And what this allows you to do is to add your own information. These are just files, PDF files. It allows you to add your own information into the custom agent to train it on that information. So in other words, I don't want, what I'm using here is ChatGPT. I don't want this model to just be a regular ChatGPT chatbot using that information. I want to train it on special information. So I created a couple of files here. One contains dietary nutrition information. Another one is a series of specific recipes. And so by putting that in the knowledge files, I'm saying to that agent, okay, you act like this. This is your information to reference when you're interacting with the user. Now, think about this from a global perspective, creating one of these in terms of the student. Well, what is the student doing exactly? Well, they're leveraging those skills that they've learned earlier in the course, right? How to create prompts, how to interact with models. That's all coming into play here to create this custom one. They're doing research to get these knowledge files to decide what kind of information am I going to supply to this custom chatbot. So that involves information research to gather that information, and all that goes into the construction of this custom chatbot. Now, this is something when we do it in the course, obviously the student does a draft of it first, then we do some response to it, peer response, we try it out, we test drive it, we make suggestions, then that allows the student to go back in, perhaps tweak the prompts a bit, maybe add some additional knowledge files. So you see, it's an ongoing process to get the customized chatbot to work a certain way. So that's what I mean basically when I say creating custom GPT. This is what the student's doing. They're creating from scratch their own version of a chatbot. Now, I should say here that what you're looking at here, this is not free. This is a subscription service. But I do use with students free versions of programs that can do the same thing, more or less. As I mentioned, I try to find resources when working with generative AI for students that don't cost anything. Now, sometimes you make concessions because things are free, but I do provide in the Google site, I do provide a much longer screencast if you're interested in something like this using a free program. So I walk you through, it's a tutorial basically, and so I walk you through how to create a custom chatbot using that free program so you don't have to incur any cost. And then I talk about what could possibly go in there in terms of prompting, how you create the prompts, how you create the knowledge files, and so on. So if you're interested in creating your own custom chatbot, you may want to take a look at that and try your hand at one and decide, hey, what can I do here? We've reached the end of our time together, and as promised, I give you one last chance to scan the QR code to go to the Google site. Just as a reminder, at the Google site, you will find most of the materials that I've been referencing throughout this presentation, all the handouts that I created, the assignment descriptions, the longer video on how to create your own custom GPT if you're interested, along with a few other third-party resources, just as by way of giving you some additional insight and information into using generative AI in the classroom. So that concludes the presentation. Hopefully you have a chance to look over those materials, think about how you might create some of your own assignments and some of the ways you might get your students to interact with generative AI. Okay, that's it for now.